A story lands on Elspeth's desk, so dangerous she refuses to print it. And when Hamish Macbeth steps in, he realizes the truth she's hiding may be far more perilous than the tale itself. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The morning had that soft, insidious dampness that creeps into bones and clothes alike. Mist clung low over Loch Dhu, curling around the jetty and the bobbing fishing boats as though reluctant to be stirred. Hamish Macbeth pulled his collar higher against the cold air, the peat smoke tang from his kitchen lingering faintly in his hair. Lugs padded ahead, nose to the ground, ears flicking at sounds too subtle for most. The dog stopped by a worn post, sniffing a trace of something out of place before trotting back to Hamish, eyes bright with unspoken concern. Along the village street, life moved quietly under the drizzle. Patel, ever meticulous, was arranging the small piles of goods outside his shop, adjusting the umbrellas to catch the least rain. The post office clerk exchanged curt nods with the occasional villager, though Hamish could see the faint irritation behind polite words. Their daily routines pressed on despite the wet and mist. At the Kirk Hall, a small cluster of tourists lingered under umbrellas, their stiff, careful posture marking them as newcomers, unfamiliar with Highland rhythms. Hamish noted, as always, the subtle social currents, a crofter muttering about the careless ways of outsiders, gossip already whispering about a missing parcel, someone said, or perhaps never delivered. Hamish walked slowly along the loch's edge, lugs circling close, sniffing every puddle and patch of turf. His eyes, however, were elsewhere, noting small details, the angle of a boat rope, a shutter swinging slightly in the breeze, footprints pressed faintly into damp soil. It was the sort of morning that made everything visible if one cared to look. He thought of Priscilla Halberton Smythe at the Kirk Hall, poised and calm, the very picture of social worlds he would never quite join. Even imagining her there brought a small, wistful tug to his chest, unspoken and neatly tucked away. By mid-morning, a subtle unease had settled over Loch Dhu. A young tourist, a girl named Elspeth, had not returned from a morning walk, though her rented cottage stood empty, shutters closed. Villagers murmured quietly among themselves. Fishers paused at the water's edge, exchanging glances, noting who had seen what, who had said what yesterday. In small communities like this, a person gone, even briefly, was noticed immediately, and the whispering began before any official word could be spoken. Hamish, meanwhile, observed the flurry with calm detachment, listening for the contradictions and hesitations that might reveal more than the gossip itself. Lugs, restless and tense, gave an occasional low bark, tail stiff as a warning or invitation. Patel's careful arrangements of produce were suddenly irrelevant to a nearby woman who stopped to mutter her observations to the grocer, barely keeping her voice low enough for propriety. A hotel maid passed, damp shawl over her head, adjusting the straps of a heavy basket, and paused to nod at Hamish, offering nothing but a faint, knowing glance. Each movement, each glance, carried its own weight of meaning, and Hamish caught it all. He noted who averted their eyes, who lingered longer than necessary, and who tried too hard to appear busy. Even small children, mud-stained and half awake, contributed to the subtle chorus of village life. The Strathbane police arrived late, as they usually did. Blair's face was a red, sullen smear of irritation, hands shoved deep into pockets, shoes clumping over the wet stone. Daviot, as ever, looked worried about appearances rather than facts, adjusting his tie more than his coat. Anderson lingered at a distance, trying to be unobtrusive but failing, his sycophantic eagerness barely masked beneath his careful posture. Hamish greeted them with a slow nod, pretending the weather and his morning walk were the sum of his concern. Inwardly, he catalogued each expression, noting how impatience, fear, and self-interest played across their features. The cold mist wrapped the loch like a second skin. Hamish followed the water's edge, noticing footprints pressed into wet soil that didn't belong to anyone familiar. A scarf caught on a fence post, the faint tang of seaweed and peat mingling in the air. Lugs sniffed each trace, ears flicking at distant calls from the village or the sudden splash of a boat oar. Hamish thought of small clues, a mislaid shoe, a note not yet delivered, a casual remark overheard in the pub yesterday. Each could mean nothing, or everything. He paused at the jetty, letting Lugs circle as he looked over the loch, noting the reflections of low clouds in water still and grey. His mind wandered to how gossip travelled here, like the water, slow in some parts, swift in others, capable of carrying stories distorted or true. A crofter appeared from a side path, tall and blunt, muttering something about the newcomers who could not tell a fishnet from a fishing line, and Hamish absorbed the comment without a word, storing it away. Lugs growled softly at the crofter's dog, and the tension passed as the man moved on. By noon, subtle alarms had spread through the village. A visitor had vanished, though whether by misadventure or something more was unclear. The town's small network of observation hummed quietly. Hotel owners checked rooms, fishers noted missing gear, and the post office clerk remembered letters unclaimed. Hamish, meanwhile, threaded gently between villagers, speaking briefly, observing their body language, their hesitations, their tiny, telling gestures. Each smile, frown, or shift of weight was a thread in the tapestry he quietly wove in his mind. Blair, noticing Hamish's leisurely movements, stepped forward with unnecessary brusqueness, demanding information that Hamish was not yet ready to share. Daviot's polite frown deepened, while Anderson hovered like a shadow. Hamish smiled faintly to himself, imagining the inner workings of their worry and incompetence. It was not that they would not act. They would, but they would not see, not as he did. Lugs padded close, offering his silent support, tail wagging once, sharply, at passing shadows. As the afternoon fog thickened, Hamish walked along the loch again, tracing the edges of the village he had known all his life. Mist clung to his coat, and the cold air stung his cheeks. He watched tourists huddle under umbrellas, villagers whisper behind curtains, and felt the rhythm of Loch Dhu breathe around him. Each detail, footstep, murmur, bird call, flickering window, was absorbed quietly, without drama, catalogued for later reflection. He turned homeward, noting the pattern of lights flickering across stone walls, the curl of peat smoke rising above rooftops, Lugs at his heel. The disappearance of the tourist remained unresolved, but already the threads of story were forming in his mind. Subtle, human, intricate, and waiting. Hamish understood the village better than anyone, the people, the tensions, the gossip. And he understood, as always, that answers lay not in haste or force, but in patience, empathy, and careful observation. Mist still hovered low as he reached his gate. Lugs paused, sniffing, ears pricked. Hamish smiled faintly and moved toward the warmth of peat fire and simple tea, mind quietly cataloguing what had been seen, what had been said, and what might yet emerge. The village of Loch Dhu hummed with life, wet, cold, and muted. Somewhere between fog and reflection the story waited. The next morning the rain had eased into a persistent drizzle, fine enough to wet hair and cloak without the abrupt violence of a storm, yet enough to make the stone paths slick and treacherous. Mist lingered low over Loch Dhu, curling around the boats moored along the jetty and clinging to the cobbles outside the hotel. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly, Lugs at his side, ears flicking at the subtle shifts in the village. The dog paused at every shadow, every splash in the puddles, nose to the ground, alert to tension that no human had yet named. Hamish's eyes followed the same rhythms, noting footprints pressed into the mud near the hotel doorway, a door left slightly ajar in a rental cottage, a guidebook splayed on a lobby table where the clerk's attention had wandered. Word had travelled quietly but efficiently. Elspeth McKinnon, a visitor who had been seen only that morning, had still not returned from her walk. Villagers whispered behind curtains and half-closed shutters, exchanging glances that were polite on the surface, sharp underneath. Fishers glanced toward the loch as they prepared nets, noting who was missing, while crofters muttered in blunt tones about the carelessness of newcomers who could not read the weather or the tides. Hamish observed without speaking, cataloguing details invisible to all but him: the crooked shutter, the faint smear of mud on the hotel steps, the lingering scent of peat mixed with damp wool. Lugs paused beside him, tail stiff, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and Hamish patted the dog gently, letting him absorb his anxiety without comment. Strathbane's representatives, who had arrived the previous day, now moved through the village with visible impatience. Blair stormed along the wet cobbles, boots squelching, his expression a cross between irritation and indignation, a spectacle of petty jealousy disguised as official concern. Daviot, more preoccupied with appearances than the facts, adjusted his tie despite the drizzle, eyes darting for potential witnesses to approve of his competence. Anderson lingered awkwardly behind them, attempting inconspicuousness while failing in the effort, shifting weight from one foot to the other, fumbling with his notepad. Hamish nodded politely, concealing amusement behind a calm expression, and stepped aside to allow them to fumble. He moved between villagers with his usual gentle discretion, speaking in soft tones and listening more than talking. At Patel's shop, he noted how the grocer adjusted a loose umbrella while giving a fleeting glance toward the loch, eyes narrowing at the tourists lingering outside. "Did she pass by here?" Hamish asked casually. Patel's reply was measured, polite, but full of the subtle inflections of opinion. Maybe, or maybe she took the path past the kirk. Hard to say. A young hotel maid added a detail she had overheard, a voice dropping just enough to feel confidential. A visitor had asked directions yesterday, but the description was vague. Every fragment was catalogued by Hamish, who understood the way gossip travelled and mutated, and the truths that hid within half-truths. A crofter, boots caked in mud, paused on the path near the loch, muttering in his blunt way. "Can't be careful, these tourists. Always think the hills are their own." Hamish noted the slight twitch of the man's lips as he glanced back at the village, pride and suspicion mixed in equal measure. Luggs sniffed the crofter's boots, tail flicking once, and Hamish smiled faintly. The dog's instincts rarely failed, and the crofter's reaction, half bemusement, half irritation, added a subtle layer of understanding to Hamish's growing picture. In the hotel lobby, a misplaced guidebook offered another fragment. Hamish noted the spine bent at a particular angle, the pages damp at the edges, a footprint on the rug nearby that did not match the bellhop's shoes. The clerk hovered, frowning at the disruption, anxious to maintain order in a world that had suddenly grown uncertain. A guest whispered of a stranger seen near the pier, and another mentioned a possible argument heard in the streets last evening, though the details were inconsistent and likely exaggerated. Hamish absorbed each piece, weighing motives and social dynamics, seeing the way pride, shame, and village jealousy threaded through even casual conversation. Blair, noticing Hamish's attention to subtlety rather than haste, frowned and barked a question at him, sharp and unnecessary. "Have you seen her Macbeth? Step aside and let us handle it properly." Hamish replied with a polite, dry smile. "I think I'll observe a little longer. Might be useful." Blair's annoyance was obvious, and Hamish made a note of the flicker of envy behind the man's eyes, the kind that drove petty cruelty and exaggerated incompetence alike. Davitt cleared his throat, suggesting a search of the loch edge, though his concern seemed more for public perception than the missing visitor, and Anderson trailed behind, offering murmured agreements that added nothing. Hamish continued his slow perusal, moving through the village paths, letting Luggs roam briefly but never far. He noticed a door slightly ajar at a small rented cottage, the latch rusted and wet. A faint scent of damp wool and peat rose from within, and footprints led toward the rear garden, pressed into soft earth. He took note, thinking not of immediate danger, but of human behaviour. The tendency to leave things carelessly, the subtle traces left behind by nerves or habit. Elsewhere, a fisher's net lay twisted, as if hastily discarded, and a small basket, presumably belonging to Elspeth, sat forgotten near the jetty. These clues, small and easily overlooked, were catalogued with quiet patience. As the drizzle thickened, Hamish moved toward the moor's edge. Mist rolled down from the hills, brushing against his coat and the damp stone walls of cottages. Luggs growled softly at a shadow passing over the loch, ears pricked, and Hamish noted the stillness in the water, the way a boat rocked subtly even when empty. Villagers passed, faces set against the weather, exchanging clipped greetings, subtle glances revealing what their words did not. Pride and suspicion wove through every interaction, and Hamish absorbed it all, stitching together a mental map of human intention and misdirection. By late afternoon, the village settled into a quiet agitation. Strathbane officers were busy with questions and paperwork, though Blair's impatience led to more noise than progress, and Davitt fretted over the optics of each inquiry. Hamish moved among the small crowds with gentle tact, listening, observing, and waiting for inconsistencies to emerge. Red herrings appeared, a misremembered conversation, a misplaced parcel, an argument overheard but misunderstood. Lug's restlessness mirrored the village's subtle tension, nose to the ground, tail flicking, eyes alert for any hint of danger or revelation. Hamish finally paused at the lock edge, letting Lug circle once more before settling at his side. The mist hung low, the water reflecting the dull grey sky, and the village felt poised between worry and routine, each person caught in their own private speculation. He considered the clues, footprints, open doors, half-heard conversations, and began to arrange them quietly in his mind. The visitor's absence was more than a simple misadventure. Subtle forces, human and social, were at work. He started the walk home, the cold mist seeping through coat and hair, lugs padding close. Villagers continued their whispered discussions, the post office clerk tending to letters, fishers checking nets, and the hotel staff attending to rooms with quiet efficiency. Hamish's thoughts moved gently, quietly connecting dots that no one else yet saw. The rain left everything glistening, the loch a muted mirror of the clouds above. As he reached his gate, he allowed himself a faint, dry smile at the careful inefficiency of Strathbane and the curious, protective vigilance of his village. Tomorrow, he would begin to uncover the layers of truth, but for now, observation was enough. Lugs pressed close, and together they entered the warmth of peat fire and simple tea, the villagers' quiet rhythms settling around them like a familiar cloak. The morning opened grey and heavy, the loch still and mirror-like beneath a low-hanging fog. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow village street, lugs padding silently at his side, ears twitching at every faint sound. The air was damp, carrying the faint tang of peat from half-extinguished hearths and the sharper scent of wet stone and seaweed from the jetty. Footsteps echoed softly across the cobbles, mingling with the occasional clatter of shutters in the breeze. Hamish pulled his coat tighter, the wool damp against his neck, and let his eyes roam carefully over the familiar patterns of Loch Dhu, noting subtle shifts that spoke more than any conversation. The Curry sisters were the first to attract his attention. They stood beneath the awning of their small, weather-worn cottage, peering through the mist with an intensity that was almost comical if it were not so serious. "Hamish," one said, voice low and edged with suspicion, "I saw someone near the cottages yesterday afternoon. Didn't look like anyone we knew." The other nodded vigorously, glancing around to ensure no one else overheard. Hamish acknowledged them with a brief nod, internalizing the statement while noting the careful politeness masking the sisters' deeper curiosity. Lugs growled softly at a passing shadow, tail stiff, and Hamish patted him reassuringly. Patel, arranging the produce outside his shop, glanced up as Hamish approached. "Hamish," he said, brushing a damp hand across a basket of apples, "there was a delivery yesterday. Late, not on schedule. Curious, I thought, but perhaps nothing." His polite tone carried the subtext of worry, pride in noticing irregularities, and the faintest shade of suspicion toward outsiders. Hamish absorbed the detail, thinking of how the delivery might intersect with the disappearance, while Lug sniffed at the ground near the shop's doorstep, alert to scents that did not belong. Further along, the hotel lobby offered another fragment. A maid, apron damp and hair tucked under a slightly crooked cap, mentioned Elspeth's peculiar habits, how she always insisted on checking room corners and leaving windows slightly open, despite the mist that seeped in. "Strange," she said, shrugging, "but perhaps just her ways." Her voice carried both hesitation and the unspoken wish not to offend, a microcosm of the village's social caution. Hamish's eyes flicked toward the misted windows of the hotel, noting the angles of the shutters and the way shadows moved within, Lugs giving a low, questioning growl. The Strathbane police had become more visible. Blair stood near the post office, hands on hips, face flushed with petty irritation, brow furrowed as he barked questions at passers-by. Daviot hovered behind him, checking that each movement seemed appropriate, conscious of appearances rather than facts. Anderson shadowed Hamish, attempting to appear useful, shifting weight nervously from one foot to the other, eyes darting for instruction that did not come. Hamish moved among them with calm detachment, noting their behaviour and the way their incompetence only made the village's subtle tensions more visible. Hamish paused at a crossroads, Lug circling anxiously at his feet, and allowed himself a moment to observe. The villagers moved through the mist with cautious purpose. A crofter emerged from a side path, boots caked in mud, muttering under his breath about tourists who could not tell peat from loch, while a hotel porter adjusted an umbrella, glancing toward the loch as though measuring potential witnesses. Pride, shame, jealousy, and long-held grudges marked every movement, subtle but readable to a careful observer. Hamish made note of each, quietly piecing together a social map that would prove as valuable as any evidence. Footsteps approached from behind. Hamish glanced over his shoulder to see Blair, hands shoved in pockets, trying to maintain authority despite the weather. "Macbeth," he said sharply, voice carrying over the drizzle. "We need statements. Everyone should be interviewed. Public safety." Hamish inclined his head, voice quiet and dry. "Of course. I'll observe a little longer. Might be useful." Blair's lip curled, a mixture of annoyance and envy, while Daviot fidgeted with his coat, clearly concerned about how the situation appeared to outsiders. Anderson shuffled behind, offering murmured affirmations. The mist thickened as Hamish continued, and Luggs's nose twitched at a faint, unfamiliar scent. Footprints pressed into the wet peat indicated movement near the cottages, slightly larger than Elspeth's shoe size, too faint for most villagers to notice, but enough for Hamish to catalogue silently. A scarf lay abandoned along the loch path, damp and twisted by the wind. Hamish crouched briefly, noting the weave and the faint trace of perfume, thinking of how small human habits left lasting marks, and how observation could reveal truth before words ever did. A crofter appeared ahead, leaning on his spade, and muttered, "Saw no one, I swear. Roads washed out, weather foul, best not wander." His tone was blunt, almost defensive, but Hamish caught the slight hesitation in the eyes, the way pride kept him from full disclosure. Luggs sniffed the crofter's boots, tail stiff, then nudged Hamish, urging caution. The interplay of village etiquette and personal grudges was subtle yet crucial, and Hamish noted it carefully. In the hotel, further fragments emerged. The clerk, eyes flicking toward shadows, mentioned a visitor asking directions to the pier yesterday, though description vague. A guest claimed to have overheard raised voices in the garden, though details did not match others' accounts. Red herrings multiplied quietly, misplaced items, contradictory statements, imagined arguments. Hamish catalogued them without judgment, weighing human tendencies, the way shame, pride, and social caution shape truth and deception alike. Luggs barked once at a passer-by, tail wagging awkwardly, bringing a faint smile to Hamish's face. The loch itself seemed a character, grey and unyielding beneath the fog, reflecting the blurred shapes of boats and jetties. Mist rose and fell across stone walls and rooftops, curling into corners where gossip and observation alike took refuge. Roads were slick and partially washed away, more paths treacherous, isolating the village in its familiar rhythms. Hamish moved with deliberate calm, letting the atmosphere guide his steps and thoughts, Luggs alert to every nuance. Blair, noticing the lack of urgency in Hamish's movements, attempted to assert authority with a sharp question, voice carrying over the drizzle. Hamish answered politely, carefully, noting the flicker of frustration and jealousy in Blair's eyes. Daviot's gaze shifted nervously, concerned with optics rather than comprehension. Anderson trailed, awkward, nearly forgotten in the mist. The contrast between police insistence and village subtlety played out quietly, a micro-drama unfolding against the damp stone and fading light. By late afternoon, the strands of information began to coalesce. Hamish reflected on the fragments gathered, the Curry sisters' sighting, Patel's late delivery, the hotel observations, the crofter's guarded comments. Each piece contained human truth, shaped by pride, fear, and habit. Luggs settled briefly at his side, tail flicking, eyes fixed on distant movement. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile at the villagers' careful balancing act, the whispered gossip, the protective vigilance, and the natural rhythms of Lochdew life. He paused near the loch's edge, fog curling around his boots, water still and reflecting the soft light of the cloudy sky. Footsteps echoed along the jetty, a gull called faintly, and the scent of peat drifted across the air. Hamish considered the day's observations, the red herrings, the subtle tensions, and felt the familiar certainty that this disappearance was more than carelessness. Tomorrow would bring closer scrutiny, quiet inquiries, and gentle manipulation of truths. But for now, the village held its secrets tightly, the mist curling around them, as if to protect them from the casual observer. Lugs nudged Hamish, and together they turned toward home. The wet cobbles glistened, the peat fire waiting, and the soft comfort of tea beckoned. The village moved quietly around them, oblivious to the careful mapping of human motives and social currents taking place in the mind of its silent, watchful constable. Mist clung to rooftops and chimneys, curling in the cold Highland air, as Hamish walked, absorbing, cataloguing, and preparing for the discoveries the morrow would surely bring. The Kirk Hall sat quiet beneath a pall of mist, its damp stone walls absorbing the soft, persistent drizzle that clung to the village. Hamish Macbeth approached slowly, lugs at his side, ears twitching at the distant clang of a bell from the church tower. The air was thick with the smell of peat smoke drifting from nearby cottages, mingling with the sharp tang of wet grass and the faint salt of the loch. Inside the hall, the light from high windows flickered across polished wood and worn pews, reflecting shadows that shifted subtly as Hamish moved. Lugs padded ahead, nose to the floor, alert to scents invisible to the eye, and Hamish allowed himself a brief moment of quiet observation, noting the stillness of the room, the chill that seeped through the stone floor, and the faint rustle of paper. It was the letter that drew him in, placed with careful deliberation on the reading desk, ink slightly smudged along the folds. Hamish leaned closer, Lug sitting stiffly at his heels, tail flicking nervously. The handwriting was neat, but the pressure inconsistent, each letter a small indication of the writer's agitation. Hamish's eyes traced the words slowly, noting phrases that hinted at knowledge some villagers preferred to hide. A subtle smile tugged at his lips, dry and quiet, as he recognized the human patterns embedded in the script: pride, fear, shame, and the need to manipulate perception. Outside, villagers gathered in small clusters, whispering, faces half hidden by hoods and umbrellas. Curry sisters lingered near the entrance, glances darting toward Hamish, curiosity tempered by caution. A crofter paused mid-step, muttering about the folly of outsiders, and a hotel maid hovered, apron damp, eyes flicking toward the letter as if it might leap off the desk and reveal secrets best kept. Gossip threaded through the misty morning, subtle and insistent, shaping behaviour even before any conversation could be had. Hamish observed, storing each flicker of expression, each hesitation, each lifted eyebrow. Strathbane officers arrived in due course, Blair's boots clattering on the stone floor, face flushed with petty impatience, hands shoved deep into pockets as though to conceal his inadequacy. Daviot followed, polished and anxious, straightening his tie with faint, futile precision, conscious of appearances more than comprehension. Anderson lingered near the door, notebook clutched, eager to be useful, yet barely perceptible to anyone not watching closely. Hamish inclined his head politely, then turned his attention back to the letter, absorbing reactions, noting the social tension each person brought with them. He began to question villagers gently, choosing his words with care. "Did you see Elspeth yesterday?" he asked a hotel maid, voice low, careful. She shifted, apron damp from the drizzle, eyes cast downward. "Well, she was, her own way," she murmured, voice hesitant. Hamish noted the subtle embarrassment, the reluctance to reveal more than politeness allowed. A crofter added his observations bluntly, boots shifting on the damp stone. "Saw her near the pier, maybe. Hard to say exactly. Roads bad, weather worse. Folks ought to mind themselves." Lugs growled softly, tail stiff, ears flicking at the crofter's uneasy glance. Hamish filed away the information, weighting it alongside the micro-expressions of pride, shame, and lingering village grudges. The letter had begun to ripple through the social fabric, changing behaviour almost imperceptibly. Some villagers avoided eye contact with Hamish or each other, shoulders tight, expressions closed. Others whispered urgently in corners, careful not to be overheard. Hamish noted each reaction with patience, understanding that human emotion, subtle and quiet, often held more truth than words. He traced a pattern in the small gestures, the twitch of an eyebrow, the sudden stillness, the slightly forced laugh, cataloguing motives and contradictions in the soft grey light of the Kirk Hall. Blair, impatient with subtlety, attempted to assert control. "Macbeth," he barked, voice echoing, "we need statements, immediately, publicly." Hamish inclined his head, voice measured, polite. Of course, perhaps best to let people speak freely first, might reveal more. Blair scowled, frustration flashing across his face, the red of petty envy deepening under his skin. Davitt cleared his throat, worried about appearances, while Anderson scribbled notes with eager inadequacy. Hamish allowed them to fumble, noting with dry amusement how little they truly understood the currents of Lochdu life. Luggs padded ahead to a sideboard where the letter lay, nose twitching, tail stiff. Hamish observed a subtle shift in the dog's posture, the slight tension in his muscles alerting him to something otherwise unseen. He followed Luggs's lead to a hidden drawer beneath the desk, unlatched and slightly ajar. Inside, a few scraps of paper, mundane at first glance, but each offering small inconsistencies, crossed-out words, marginal notes, signs of minor deception. Hamish catalogued the details, noting how small errors reflected human preoccupation, anxiety, and the desire to control perception. Outside, the fog thickened, curling through streets and across the loch, muffling distant footsteps and the clatter of shutters. Midges swarmed in pools of stagnant water, adding to the slow, melancholy cadence of the morning. Hamish absorbed the sensory environment as part of his investigation, understanding that mood, weather, and human behaviour interwove seamlessly. He observed villagers pacing, peering through windows, exchanging brief whispers, each movement a thread in the wider fabric of tension and secrecy. A hotel maid mentioned a small argument overheard, voices raised, though details were inconsistent. A crofter muttered about unpaid debts and prideful refusals, shoulders hunched against the damp. The Curry sisters, still observing, cast furtive glances toward the sideboard, and then to Hamish, expression polite but sharp, noting how the constable might interpret their observations. Every microdrama layered upon another, and Hamish catalogued them quietly, assembling a mental map of human motives intertwined with environmental cues: the fog, the wet stone, the peat smoke curling in the air, the low murmur of voices. Blair attempted to take the letter from the desk, brusque and officious. Hamish placed a hand over it, voice low, calm. Perhaps best left here for now. It will reveal more if undisturbed. Blair's lip curled in irritation, while Davitt shifted uneasily, aware of optics but uncertain of procedure. Anderson hovered, eager to witness, nearly invisible in his flustered attention. Hamish noted how control, pride, and caution played into their responses, understanding that these reactions were as revealing as the letter itself. By mid-afternoon, the village had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The letter had altered behaviour subtly. Some avoided the desk entirely, others lingered, whispering, each weighing what could be safely shared. Hamish moved among them with gentle inquiry, eliciting fragments of truth, noticing small hesitations, the way pride held information back, and shame altered gestures. Luggs remained alert, nose to the ground, ears flicking at any sudden movement, tail stiff, occasionally emitting a low, quiet warning growl that Hamish acknowledged with a brief pat. The fog over the loch deepened, the water a muted mirror of the grey sky, and the Kirk Hall felt enclosed in its own private atmosphere, half lit by flickering sunlight through damp windows. Hamish stepped back, taking in the whole scene, the villagers' cautious movements, the police's futile efforts at control, the hidden drawer, and the subtle hints of anxiety in every gesture. Each element, subtle, human, and tangible, wove together a tapestry that suggested motives, pride, and secrets deeper than the surface letter alone could convey. He stepped to the door, letting Luggs slip ahead first, ears alert to any unusual sound. Outside, the fog curled across paths and rooftops. The loch rippled faintly in a breeze that carried the scent of wet peat and distant rain. Villagers murmured in corners, crofters paused briefly on moor paths, and the hotel staff moved efficiently yet invisibly. Hamish allowed himself a quiet exhale, noting the patterns and contradictions, the small truths hidden within gossip and hesitation. Tomorrow would reveal more, but today the letter had served both as clue and red herring, opening windows into human pride, shame, and the careful guarding of secrets. He began the slow walk home, the damp stones slick beneath boots, Luggs at his side, alert and steady. The fog clung to rooftops and chimneys, curling like smoke from unseen fires. Hamish's thoughts traced the day's observations, the small gestures, the hushed whispers, and the micro-tensions of Lochdu life. Peat smoke rose from cottages as twilight neared, merging with mist over the loch, and the village seemed suspended between uncertainty and routine. Hamish and Luggs moved quietly, cataloguing, considering, knowing that each subtle detail would shape the day to come. The moors were shrouded in mist, a rolling, almost living presence that blurred the boundaries between path, peat, and shadow. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly, boots sinking slightly into the damp turf, Luggs padding close, ears flicking at every rustle of grass or brush of wind. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the faint tang of rain that had fallen hours before, mixed with the enduring scent of peat smoke from the village hearths. A distant hotel window glowed dimly, light flickering across the wet stone, and Hamish paused to observe how shadows stretched and merged, thinking quietly as the mist curled around him. Luggs growled softly, nose twitching, tail stiff, a silent alert to movement Hamish could not yet identify. The village below was muted, but not absent. From the distance came occasional sounds, the clatter of shutters against stone, the low hum of conversation drifting from the pub, the cautious footfalls of crofters returning late from fields. Hamish noted the micro-tensions threaded through these familiar rhythms, glances exchanged that were polite yet measured, murmured words that concealed annoyance or pride, a waitress lingering just long enough to catch a patron's hesitation. Each detail, small and quiet, spoke volumes to Hamish's practiced eye. Luggs sniffed at a tuft of grass disturbed recently, tail flicking once, and Hamish crouched briefly to examine footprints pressed into the soft mud, noting size, depth, and direction. The crofter appeared ahead, sleeves damp, boots heavy with peat. He paused mid-step, muttering under his breath about tourists who could not read the weather, shifting weight from one foot to another. Hamish observed without intrusion, noting the slight tension in the man's shoulders, the careful way he avoided drawing attention to himself while still asserting ownership over the path. Luggs sniffed, low growl rumbling, and Hamish laid a gentle hand on the dog's head, sensing the crofter's pride and quiet irritation before it fully emerged in speech. Blair's voice carried suddenly across the moor, impatient and grating. "Macbeth, where are you? We can't have this wandering about in the dark." Hamish allowed a faint, dry smile. "I find things best when the night is quiet," he replied softly, tone calm, measured. Daviot's figure followed, moving with care, eyes scanning for witnesses or the possibility of misrepresentation. Anderson trailed behind, notebook ready, feet slipping slightly in the wet peat. Hamish noted the contrast between the police's anxious display and the subtle rhythms of the village night, cataloguing their human foibles while Luggs continued to tense at distant shadows. A sudden movement in the fog drew Hamish's attention, a flutter of cloth, a jacket caught in the brambles at the moor's edge. He approached, Luggs sniffing eagerly, tail stiff. It was a tourist's jacket, misplaced and damp, sleeves twisted, partially hidden by the grass. Hamish crouched, noting the pattern of folds, the faint trace of mud, the angle of disturbance. A red herring, he realized immediately. Nothing indicated harm, yet the discovery would unsettle both villagers and police, inflating concerns and intensifying scrutiny. He let Luggs circle the area, watching the dog's responses, observing the subtle shifts in human presence on the moor. The wind picked up, stirring the mist into roiling swathes that crept across the paths, snaking through tussocks and low stone walls. Hamish adjusted his coat and hat, boots squelching in the soft earth, thinking quietly about human behaviour, small patterns that revealed larger truths. He noted how the hotel lights flickered, casting brief illuminations across the ground, and how shadows appeared to move with purpose before dissolving into fog. Microdrama unfolded in every detail. A pub door opened and closed, laughter restrained and polite, a crofter adjusting a gate quietly, as if to assert control over the night's chaos. Hamish paused near a stand of gorse, listening. Voices drifted faintly on the wind, muted arguments over minor slights, a whisper of jealousy, pride, and old village grudges. Luggs growled, low, alert, tail stiff, and Hamish allowed the dog to lead him a few paces, noting the subtle disturbance in the undergrowth. A boot print different from those he had catalogued earlier, angled strangely, perhaps from an outsider or a momentary misstep. Each observation layered upon another, human motives intertwined with environmental cues, the fog, the cold air, the wet earth, and the occasional brush of midges. Blair's figure loomed closer again, shouting instructions that were both clumsy and ill-informed. "Macbeth, stand still. Let us handle it. No wandering about alone." Hamish's lips twitched at the absurdity of the command, voice quiet and even. "I prefer to let the night guide my thoughts. Better to observe first than disturb." Davitt flinched slightly, adjusting his collar, conscious of optics but uncertain of how to intervene. Anderson hovered, pen poised, nearly invisible, and Hamish continued, careful to mislead without cruelty, allowing the police to feel in control while he quietly retained it. The storm moved in with deliberate slowness, clouds roiling, the loch reflecting the gloom above, faintly illuminated by intermittent flashes of distant lightning. Hamish watched the movement of the water, the mist curling and thickening, and thought of the patterns in human behaviour, the small hesitations, the furtive glances, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact. Lugs barked softly at a rustle of wind-blown reeds, and Hamish crouched again to examine footprints that had appeared between patches of grass, noting the depth, spacing, and direction. The jacket lay partially hidden in gorse, damp, twisted, but otherwise unremarkable. Hamish noted how its discovery would be interpreted: fear, guilt, suspicion, though in truth it offered little beyond a small clue to movement, misplacement, and human error. He straightened, eyes scanning the moor, absorbing the subtle interactions between people and environment. A crofter adjusting a fence post, a hotel window darkened as blinds were drawn, the faint shuffle of boots along distant stone paths. Lugs circled, sniffing the edge of a small ditch where peat had been disturbed, tail flicking, ears pricked. Hamish followed, observing the tension in the dog's movements, noting the micro signs of alertness and caution. The moor, blanketed in mist, felt alive, the quiet drama of village life playing out in miniature gestures, private arguments, and human pride carefully managed. Every observation, every small movement contributed to a growing understanding of motives, contradictions, and subtle social tensions. The fog thickened further, curling over rocks and drifts, muffling footsteps, softening shapes. Hamish's coat became damp, his gloves moist, but his mind moved clearly, arranging information in quiet patterns. He reflected on the villagers' behaviour, politeness layered over suspicion, pride concealed behind cordial smiles, old grudges flickering in quick glances. Lugs nudged his hand gently, and Hamish allowed himself a faint, dry smile, acknowledging the dog's silent counsel. As he turned toward the village, storm clouds darkening the horizon, Hamish felt the familiar pull of reflection. The jacket, footprints, crofters' mutterings, hotel windows, and whispered arguments all wove together into a tapestry of human behaviour that required careful observation, empathy, and subtle manipulation. Blair and Davitt's fumbling presence, Anderson's anxious shadowing, the protective vigilance of villagers, all became part of the quiet lesson of the night. Hamish and Lugs moved down the damp path toward the village lights blurred by mist, boots leaving soft impressions in the saturated earth. The moor behind them seemed to exhale, mist curling upward, water reflecting storm clouds, and the air held a faint, enduring melancholy. Hamish's mind catalogued small contradictions, minor deceptions, and the patterns that only careful observation could reveal. Each detail, subtle and human, promised understanding without force, revelation without confrontation. The night deepened, fog curling low over rooftops, chimneys sending up thin trails of smoke, and the village settled into its quiet rhythms. Hamish's boots splashed gently in puddles, Lugs at his side, tail flicking, ears pricked. The moor, the mist, and the storm-swept loch behind them held secrets, hints, and half-truths. Hamish knew that tomorrow would require patience, quiet inquiry, and careful interpretation of small gestures. Tonight, observation and understanding were enough, and the soft melancholy of Highland night wrapped around them as they entered the familiar streets, ready to resume the slow work of uncovering truth. The morning was damp and grey, with a low mist clinging to the moors and curling over the loch. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow path that followed the water's edge, Lugs padding closely, ears twitching at every faint sound. The peat underfoot was soft and slippery, waterlogged from the previous night's drizzle, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the lingering tang of smoke from village chimneys. Hamish pulled his coat tighter around his lanky frame, boots squelching, and allowed himself a slow, careful survey of the fields and cottages ahead. Lugg sniffed the air, growled softly at a movement in the reeds, and nudged Hamish for reassurance. Together they moved toward the crofts, knowing that answers often lay in the subtle tensions of daily life, rather than in anything overtly dramatic. The crofters were already at work, boots caked in mud, sleeves damp with rain. One leaned on his spade, eyes flicking toward Hamish with the mix of pride and caution that marked most of the village. "Mornin', Hamish," he said, voice blunt, carrying a slight edge. "Weather's foul. Road's washed out. You'd best be careful." Hamish nodded politely, noting the twitch of a shoulder, the glance toward a neighbouring croft, the silent communication of old grudges held and resentments left unspoken. Luggs growled softly at the faint movement behind the crofter, tail stiff, and Hamish laid a hand gently on the dog's head, acknowledging the tension without drawing attention. He began his inquiries with quiet, careful questions. "Did Elspeth pass this way yesterday?" he asked, voice low. The crofter shifted weight, boots sinking slightly into the peat. "Might have. Hard to say. Roads slick, paths treacherous. Folk passing through don't always look where they tread." Hamish noted the hesitation, the slight avoidance of eye contact, the unspoken message wrapped in the words. The crofter was protecting pride, avoiding shame, and managing gossip in the same breath. Luggs pressed close, nose to the ground, sensing the subtle unease in the air. Further along, another crofter paused beside a leaning fence, glancing toward the loch as if measuring the wind. "Saw a jacket yesterday, lost near the edge," he muttered, voice low, almost to himself. "Not sure who it belonged to. Might be nothing." Hamish crouched slightly, eyes narrowing as he observed the small tremor in the man's hands, the careful avoidance of direct detail. A misplacement, perhaps, or a deliberate omission. The patterns of human behaviour were layered, and Hamish catalogued each nuance. Lugg sniffed at the wet grass, tail flicking, and Hamish allowed the dog to circle, noting reactions of the villagers around them. Blair appeared on the path ahead, hands shoved into pockets, expression impatient. "Macbeth, this is hardly the time for wandering. We need statements, precise and immediate." Hamish's lips twitched in a dry, private smile. "I find the best way is to observe first, then speak," he replied quietly. Blair's face reddened slightly, Davitt shifting uneasily behind him, concerned with appearances rather than facts. Anderson hovered, pen poised, notebook clutched, eager but invisible to most. Hamish noted each reaction, appreciating the contrast between the village's subtle rhythms and the police's obvious discomfort. A small argument erupted near the fishers' nets. Two villagers, voices low and clipped, debated over fishing rights and the placement of traps. Politeness edged their words, but pride and old rivalries laced every syllable. Hamish listened, noting how resentment and human frailty played into seemingly trivial disputes. Luggs growled softly, tail stiff, as if echoing the tension Hamish catalogued. The argument dissolved into silence, the men returning to work, yet traces of emotion lingered in the slight tightness of their shoulders and the careful glances toward the loch. Patel emerged from his shop, umbrella tilted against the drizzle, and spoke to Hamish in a tone that was polite but edged with subtle curiosity. "Hamish, there was a delivery late yesterday, arrived in the fog. Strange, perhaps, or maybe nothing at all." Hamish nodded, noting the careful avoidance of speculation in Patel's words, the hint of village pride in reporting minutiae accurately. He filed the detail alongside footprints, discarded jackets, and whispered arguments, each a thread in the intricate web of human behaviour he quietly observed. The weather shifted subtly, mist thickening, the loch now a sheet of grey glass, reflecting clouds rolling across distant hills. Hamish observed the interplay of light and shadow, noting how windows flickered with reflection, chimneys sent up thin curls of smoke, and rooftops glistened with damp. Villagers moved carefully, voices low, eyes shifting, each carrying pride, secrecy, or subtle envy. Hamish catalogued these nuances, small gestures revealing larger truths, hesitation before speech, fleeting glances, and the micro-expression of shame or embarrassment. The lost jacket Hamish had already seen at the edge of the small marsh still lay there, sleeves twisted, damp, the collar half buried in soft peat. Hamish noted how its appearance might inflame curiosity, incite speculation, or mislead both villagers and police. Lugg sniffed, growled low, and nudged Hamish toward a faint trail leading into undergrowth. Hamish crouched, boots muddy, considering human intention and the subtleties of behaviour. Was this carelessness or something more deliberate? Each clue, each pattern demanded patience, observation, and careful inference. Micro-tension arose when a crofter accidentally dropped a tool near the water's edge, the clang echoing sharply in the mist. Luggs barked once, tail stiff, and Hamish stepped closer to steady the man, voice gentle. "Careful now," he murmured, noting the brief spike of alarm in the crofter's expression, quickly masked by pride. The small incident highlighted the fragility of routine under stress, the interplay of human caution and social etiquette, and the ways villagers masked emotion with habit. Hamish moved among the crofts, speaking quietly, letting Lugg circle and explore. Subtle hints emerged, minor debts, past disagreements, small jealousies between families, lingering old grudge lines. Each person was fully human, prideful, secretive, protective of their own, and cautious with outsiders. Statements contradicted each other, leaving gaps only filled by observation, empathy, and careful inference. Hamish noted the weight of these small truths against the wider context of the missing visitor and the subtle shifts in village dynamics that followed each revelation. The drizzle intensified briefly, beads of water collecting on coats, hats, and reeds along the loch. Fog drifted across the moor, curling into hedgerows, making familiar paths unfamiliar. Hamish paused, boots in wet peat, taking stock of the subtle currents of tension around him. Luggs nudged his hand, reminding him of the quiet alertness needed, the constant attention to small disturbances that might reveal human intent. The village's private dramas played out gently in whispers, gestures, and eye contact, each interaction layered with meaning. By late afternoon, the day's observations had formed a pattern in Hamish's mind. He could see the interlocking human motives: pride, jealousy, old rivalries, careful concealment of shame. Luggs remained alert, tail flicking, nose to the ground, responding to the faintest shift in scent or sound. Blair, frustrated by Hamish's patient methods, stomped along the path, voice raised unnecessarily. Daviot shifted behind him, adjusting coat and tie, and Anderson scurried close to Hamish, pen poised but hesitating. Hamish allowed them to act, observing quietly, knowing that insight came from patience, not assertion. The mist settled into the evening, curling low over rooftops and fields, the loch reflecting grey clouds and faint light. Peat smoke rose in thin columns from chimneys, mingling with the damp, cold air. Hamish walked back toward the village, boots leaving soft impressions in the saturated earth, Luggs at his side. He catalogued every hesitation, glance, and whispered conversation, the weight of small human dramas recorded quietly in his mind. Red herrings, misplaced tools, contradictory statements, minor disputes were recognized as such, catalogued alongside the subtle truths. The crofters returned to their homes, the hotel staff to their duties, and the village seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Hamish paused at the loch's edge, looking across the water, mist curling along the surface, and reflected quietly on human nature: pride, shame, protective instincts, and the way small gestures carried the meaning of larger truths. Luggs nudged him gently, tail flicking, and Hamish allowed a faint, dry smile. The night had yielded small revelations, human insight, and the quiet satisfaction of observation, yet larger questions lingered, and the pattern of secrets and social tension promised more to uncover in the days ahead. The morning fog had not lifted, curling low over Loch Dhu and threading through the village streets like a soft, persistent sigh. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the wet cobbles, Luggs at his heels, nose twitching at every scent, ears pricked for subtle disturbances. The air was cold and damp, carrying the lingering tang of peat smoke from hearths long banked against the night chill. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed quickly by mist and stone. Hamish pulled his coat tighter, boots squelching in shallow puddles, and let his eyes roam across rooftops and fences, observing small movements, a shutter adjusting in the breeze, a cat padding along a wall, the careful glance of a crofter measuring the wind. It was near the jetty that movement caught his eye. A figure, hunched against the drizzle, emerging from the mist. Lug stiffened instantly, growling softly, tail bristled. Hamish's heart lifted quietly. The figure straightened, revealing the familiar posture of Elspeth McKinnon, clothes damp and hair dishevelled, cheeks flushed with exertion and cold. Relief rippled through the village air before Hamish even spoke. Villagers peered from doorways, umbrellas clutched, faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and quiet hope. Elspeth's voice was soft but steady as she spoke, explaining how she had lost her way while walking the moors, the mist thickening, paths slippery, unfamiliar landmarks confusing her. Hamish watched carefully, noting subtle inconsistencies, slight pauses before answers, a frown that vanished too quickly, a hand brushing damp hair from her face as she spoke. Villagers reacted in the manner predictable yet revealing. Some avoided her gaze, careful not to betray opinion. Others whispered urgently, barely audible, gossip threading through the cold air. Lug circled, tail flicking, nose to the ground, mirroring Hamish's cautious optimism, alert to tension or residual danger. Blair arrived, boots clattering on wet stones, face red with impatience. "Macbeth, there, see? Nothing serious. Everyone calm now." His voice was brisk, assertion intended to claim credit. Daviot followed, adjusting his coat, worried more about appearances than facts, glancing nervously at villagers for approval or critique. Anderson lingered behind Hamish, pen poised, notebook clutched, eager yet uncertain, waiting for direction that did not come. Hamish's lips twitched in a faint, dry smile. Let them fumble, he thought. Observation and empathy were far more useful than authority in Loch-Dhu. Hamish stepped forward, voice quiet, neutral. "Elspeth, are you quite certain of the path you took?" He noted her slight hesitation, eyes flicking briefly toward the distant hills, then back at him. I tried to follow the trail," she murmured, tone careful. "The fog came up faster than I expected, and I could not see familiar landmarks. I kept moving, hoping to find the cottages or the jetty." Her gestures were precise, restrained, but the way she clutched her coat and rubbed her wet gloves together betrayed lingering discomfort and fatigue. Hamish catalogued every subtle sign, the tension in her shoulders, the rhythm of her breathing, the slight turn of her head as she considered the village faces observing her return. Villagers murmured softly among themselves, curiosity and relief mingled with suspicion. Who had seen her? Who had helped her or ignored her? Whose pride or jealousy might benefit from her disappearance? Hamish observed each face in turn. A crofter leaning slightly on a spade, eyes narrowing at a hotel window. The Curry sisters whispering, hands folded to contain expression. Patel adjusting his umbrella, gaze flicking toward the pier. Lugs barked softly at a movement along the quay, tail stiff, and Hamish noted the dog's alertness, recognizing it as a mirror to his own careful scrutiny. Blair, seeing the villagers' whispered discussions, stepped forward brusquely. "Clearly everything is settled. We can rest easy." His face was flushed with triumph, but Hamish noted the subtle errors in his assertion. The villagers were not settled, merely reassessing. Daviot's expression was polite but strained, a faint line across his forehead as he calculated how appearances would read beyond Loch-Dhu. Anderson jotted notes diligently, oblivious to the subtleties that Hamish was attuned to. Hamish allowed them to occupy themselves, quietly guiding the investigation with gentle questions and unobtrusive observations. A tea tray arrived from a nearby cottage, small cups and a steaming pot, the peat fire from inside sending wisps of smoke through the half-open door. Hamish gestured for Elspeth to follow him inside, Lugs padding obediently at his heels. The warmth, the aroma of brewed leaves, the gentle flicker of firelight provided calm contrast to the tension outside. Villagers lingered respectfully at the doorway, watching, whispering, but careful not to intrude. Hamish's eyes scanned faces, noting pride, subtle judgment, envy, and relief reflected in each expression. Elspeth sipped tea carefully, and Hamish asked simple, quiet questions, listening closely to tone and phrasing. "Did anyone speak to you on the moor?" he asked, eyes scanning the dim interior for signs of unease. She shook her head slowly. "No one. Just the wind, and I tried to follow landmarks I thought I knew. The fog confused me." Hamish noticed the slight twitch of her lip, the careful avoidance of eye contact when mentioning the landmarks, the micro-hesitation that spoke of uncertainty. Lugs pressed against her ankle briefly, offering reassurance, tail flicking once. Outside, the village continued its subtle scrutiny. A crofter adjusted a fence, peering at the window. A hotel clerk tidied a ledge, glancing toward the doorway. Gossip flowed quietly, questions posed in half-words, glances exchanged, the usual weave of social tension made visible. Hamish noted each interaction, the mixture of protection and curiosity, subtle corrections and embellishments of stories. Red herrings, the misremembered footsteps, a half-seen shadow, were clarified in the warmth and calm of the cottage. The mist over the loch thickened, cold and soft, muffling distant sounds, reflecting the subdued light of early afternoon. Hamish encouraged Elspeth to describe the route she had taken, noting contradictions and pauses without pressing, allowing the psychological picture to emerge naturally. He watched for pride, embarrassment, and subtle concealments, aware that villagers observed every gesture as carefully as he did. Lugs remained alert, tail flicking at faint sounds, and Hamish allowed himself a faint, dry smile at the dog's impeccable judgment. The day progressed with quiet domesticity. Tea was sipped, peat fire warmed damp clothing, and small domestic gestures, the folding of gloves, adjustment of shawls, patting of damp hair, filled the space between questions. Hamish's observations continued, cataloguing both human behaviour and environmental cues. Fog shifting across the loch, water dripping from roof eaves, the soft creak of floorboards. Each detail contributed to the mental map forming in his mind, guiding the eventual unravelling of events. By late afternoon, the immediate tension had subsided. Villagers retreated to routine, though eyes lingered and whispers continued, curiosity entwined with relief. Blair attempted one last flourish of authority, misreading the scene and asserting control, while Daviot fretted quietly over optics, and Anderson busied himself with notes. Hamish allowed them their minor triumphs, knowing that insight lay not in haste or noise, but in careful observation and gentle probing of human behaviour. Lugs nudged Hamish gently, tail flicking, alert but relaxed, and Hamish returned the gesture with a quiet pat. The visitor's return had resolved immediate fears, clarified red herrings, and allowed subtle social tensions to shift naturally. Yet beneath the calm, patterns of pride, jealousy, and secrecy remained, threads Hamish noted carefully, understanding they would guide the next steps. He glanced toward the window where the loch reflected mist and cloud, quiet and grey, and allowed a brief sense of melancholy to settle. The visitor's safe return, the warmth of the cottage, the muted chatter of the village, and the steady presence of Lugs created a fragile peace. Hamish considered the small gestures of protection, the restrained relief, the subtle social corrections that would ripple through Loch Dhu. Each person's pride, each careful glance, each whispered conversation mattered, weaving a fabric of observation and understanding that only he could read fully. The day's events had narrowed the field of possibility, clarified motives, and prepared the village for the unfolding of truths yet to come. Hamish rose slowly, Lugs at his side, and stepped toward the door, the mist curling along the path, the loch quiet and reflective. Villagers watched, their expressions a mixture of relief and ongoing curiosity. Hamish allowed himself a faint, dry smile, noting the patterns in human behaviour, the subtle corrections of gossip, and the enduring rhythms of village life. The moor beyond the cottages lay shrouded in mist, waiting, and Hamish knew the work of understanding, of gentle probing, and of quiet observation was far from over. With Lugs alert at his heels, he moved back into the evening light, ready to trace the next thread of human motive and Highland intrigue. Mist hung low over Loch Dhu, thick and unrelenting, curling around rooftops, stone walls, and the narrow village streets. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly, boots sinking slightly in the damp peat of the lane, Lugs close at heel, ears twitching at every sound the fog could disguise. The loch was grey and still, reflecting the muted light of a sky heavy with rain, its surface rippling gently with each gust of wind that swept across the moor. Hamish adjusted his collar, the chill seeping through his coat, and allowed his eyes to roam over familiar shapes rendered strange by the fog. Even the smallest detail, a shutter swinging, a stray basket by the jetty, a glint of metal on wet stone, drew his attention, catalogued and filed against memory and instinct. The village was quieter than usual, each resident moving cautiously, awareness heightened by the lingering uncertainty surrounding Elspeth McKinnon's disappearance. Villagers glanced from window to window, whispered to one another, and gestured with polite restraint, concealing emotion beneath long-standing social codes. Hamish noted each expression, the hesitation before speech, the subtle twitch of a shoulder or glance to the side, the guarded tone that carried pride, shame, or jealousy. Lugs padded ahead, nose to the ground, growling softly at shadows or the creak of a gate, tail flicking, a mirror to the constable's own quiet attentiveness. Hamish began to revisit each clue he had collected. Footprints near the loch's edge, the mislaid jacket, small disturbances near the Kirk Hall, statements from crofters and hotel staff, and the fragments of gossip that had circulated since the visitor's return. Each detail, minor in isolation, took on new significance when viewed through the lens of human behaviour and village politics. He observed how pride had influenced the crofters' responses, how hotel staff weighed politeness against self-interest, and how minor jealousies had shifted allegiance and perception without anyone fully conscious of the change. Blair appeared first, boots clattering against wet stone, face flushed with impatience and the need for authority. "Macbeth, surely you've got it figured out by now," he barked, hands on hips, looking to the villagers for support, though they remained carefully neutral. Daviot followed, adjusting his tie, concerned with optics rather than accuracy, while Anderson hovered behind Hamish, pen poised, notebook trembling slightly with eagerness. Hamish allowed them to perform, aware that their interference could be useful if guided subtly. He spoke gently, encouraging the villagers to recount events in their own words, observing closely for inconsistencies, micro-expressions, and small admissions buried in speech. The crofters, emboldened by Hamish's calm attention, began to reveal small truths that had been carefully concealed. One spoke of an argument over fishing rights, another of a minor debt between families, and a third muttered about a misunderstanding that had grown over time, feeding pride and resentment. Each disclosure was tentative, framed with politeness, eyes flicking to neighbours for approval or disapproval. Lugs paced, nose to the ground, growling softly at a sudden movement in the reeds, alerting Hamish to the subtle tension that underpinned these revelations. A hotel maid offered her own insight, voice careful, glancing toward the distant loch. "Elspeth seemed uneasy yesterday," she said, hands clasped over her apron. "She asked questions that weren't usual, but maybe nothing." Hamish noted the hesitation, the glance toward the crofters, the way pride restrained fuller disclosure. Each observation layered upon another, revealing a tapestry of human motive: jealousy, secrecy, the desire to maintain appearances, and the intricate navigation of social codes. The fog thickened, curling over fences and stone walls, making familiar streets strange and uncertain. Hamish moved deliberately, boots soft in mud, senses attuned to the faintest shifts. Lug sniffed at disturbed ground, tail stiff, emitting a low, quiet growl. A loose stone slipped beneath Hamish's foot as he crouched to examine a track near the loch's edge, and for a moment both he and Lugs paused, careful not to disturb the environment unnecessarily. It was a small, cosy-level danger, a reminder of human vulnerability, but no alarm arose, just a quiet acknowledgement of caution, the kind familiar to anyone who walked these damp, uneven paths regularly. Hamish's attention returned to the pattern of human interaction. He noted how each villager managed their expression and gesture, how old grudges softened or hardened under scrutiny, and how pride and shame guided confession and concealment alike. Footprints, mislaid items, and half-spoken sentences coalesced into a coherent picture, subtle yet compelling. Red herrings, the jacket, conflicting statements, minor disputes, fell away under the scrutiny of observation and empathy, revealing truths about loyalty, deception, and the unspoken codes of Loch Dhu life. The distant loch reflected grey clouds streaked with faint light, waves rippling silently under the faint wind. Hamish paused, looking across the water, boots damp, coat sodden. Luggs settled briefly at his side, tail flicking, eyes alert. He allowed a quiet, dry smile to form. The human absurdity, the pettiness, the politeness masking suspicion, the bureaucratic incompetence of Strathbane remained present, yet beneath it lay patterns, connections and motives that required only patience and careful observation to uncover. Blair's impatience flared again as he attempted to claim credit for supposed breakthroughs, striding forward with clumsy authority. Hamish spoke softly, guiding villagers' recollections gently, letting their own words clarify misunderstandings while allowing the police to feel useful. Daviot's brow furrowed, conscious of image, while Anderson continued to scribble, misinterpreting subtle cues and adding confusion where none existed. Hamish's amusement was quiet, dry, internal, as he continued to pass gestures, pauses, and half-words. Small domestic actions punctuated the investigation. A cottage door opened to let in a gust of wind. A peat fire sent up thin smoke curling through a window. A kettle whistled faintly in a nearby home. These details, minor yet persistent, framed the human activity within the Highland environment, reinforcing mood, tempo, and the delicate balance of tension and relief. Luggs barked softly at a shadow passing near the Kirk Hall, tail stiff, drawing Hamish's attention to a small disturbance that might otherwise have been overlooked. Gradually, inconsistencies in statements began to reveal themselves. Footprints in the mud did not always match recollections. Angles of discarded items contradicted accounts, and subtle gestures, the twitch of a lip, a frown, a pause too long, hinted at truths previously obscured. Hamish pieced these together quietly, noting the interplay of pride, fear, and social necessity, understanding that human behaviour was as telling as any physical clue. The fog deepened further, curling along rooftops, hedgerows, and the loch's edge. Drizzle dampened hair and coat, but Hamish's mind remained clear, moving gently between observation and reflection. Luggs nudged him once, tail flicking, reminding him of the persistent presence of instinct alongside reason. Villagers continued their cautious movements, eyes lifted and lowered, whispers passing in corners, gestures calculated to convey civility while concealing emotion. Each thread contributed to Hamish's understanding of the event, the subtle manipulations, and the eventual revelation that was slowly, inevitably, taking shape. By evening, patterns had emerged, the red herrings had been filtered, and the quiet truths of human motive began to coalesce. Pride, jealousy, secrecy, and loyalty all revealed themselves in micro-gestures and hesitant speech. Hamish surveyed the misted loch, the curling smoke, and the dim windows, noting the interplay of environment and human psychology. The village had shifted imperceptibly, behaviour softened or stiffened by the unfolding clarity, and Hamish understood that the next steps would bring resolution. Luggs pressed close, alert, and Hamish allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction, knowing that subtle observation, empathy, and gentle manipulation had prepared the ground for the final revelations. The moor beyond the village lay shrouded in mist, wind gusting over uneven ground, and the loch reflected the grey of clouds tinged with fading light. Hamish turned toward home, Luggs at his side, boots leaving soft impressions in the saturated earth. The village settled into quiet rhythms, the subtle tensions temporarily subdued, the human patterns laid bare for those with the patience to observe. Each step carried him closer to the resolution of the mystery, and Hamish felt the familiar pull of anticipation tempered by calm understanding. The Highland night was heavy and cold, yet alive with observation, reflection, and the promise of insight. A slow drizzle fell over Loch Dhu, leaving the village damp but still, each stone of the streets darkened with rain, rooftops glistening, and the loch reflecting muted grey and silver. Hamish Macbeth walked calmly along the familiar paths, Luggs at his heels, ears flicking at distant movements, tail occasionally swishing against his legs. The morning air was sharp with peat smoke and the lingering scent of wet grass. Mist clung to low-lying fields and the edges of cottages, softening shapes and muting sounds. Hamish's eyes roamed over rooftops, fences, and the darkened windows of hotel rooms. Even in the quiet, he could read tension, anticipation, and subtle unease among the villagers. Hamish had requested a gathering at the Kirk Hall, discreet yet large enough for key villagers and the Strathbane police to witness. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of damp wood and long-banked peat, with flickering candlelight illuminating polished pews and stone floors. Lugs padded near the entrance, tails stiff, ears twitching at the murmur of voices. Hamish observed the congregation quietly. Crofters leaned on gateposts, fishers adjusted the cuffs of wet jackets, and hotel staff lingered at the back, glances alert, hands busy but restless. The Curry sisters sat near the front, their hands folded neatly, faces polite but intent, eyes searching for nuance in every gesture. Blair, standing with hands on hips and scowl firmly in place, muttered under his breath, clearly irritated by the calm proceedings. Daviot adjusted his tie for the third time, fretting over appearances rather than comprehension, and Anderson hovered behind Hamish, notebook at the ready, pen poised, clearly expecting direction and unsure of what to record. Hamish's lips twitched faintly. Let them fumble, he thought. Observation and subtle guidance were far more effective than the bluster and bureaucracy the officers offered. "Thank you for gathering," Hamish began, voice quiet, steady, measured. "I have been considering recent events, statements and observations, and I believe it is time to bring clarity to what has unsettled our village." He paused, eyes sweeping over the room, noting each micro-reaction. A crofter shifted slightly, boots squeaking against the damp floor. A hotel maid's fingers tightened briefly on her apron. The Curry sisters exchanged an almost imperceptible glance. Lugg sat close, tail flicking, eyes bright with attention, mirroring Hamish's calm alertness. He began gently recounting facts, carefully arranging them in a narrative of human behaviour, not accusation. Footprints at the lock's edge, the misplaced jacket, the minor disputes among crofters, the whispered observations at Patel's shop and the hotel lobby, all were presented with subtle emphasis on human tendencies, pride, jealousy, and the desire to protect reputation. Hamish observed reactions closely, noting how each person processed information differently. He allowed pauses, letting the weight of detail settle before continuing, encouraging reflection rather than confrontation. A crofter raised a hand cautiously. "So, this wasn't simply an accident then?" he asked, voice low, wary of both blame and embarrassment. Hamish inclined his head, gentle, precise. "Not an accident in the sense of carelessness alone, but certainly not deliberate harm. Understanding lies in observing motives, patterns, and human error." The man exhaled slowly, shoulders easing, lugs giving a quiet, approving growl. The subtle reassurance in gesture and tone eased tension more effectively than any forceful declaration. Hamish moved through the room, noting the interplay of pride and secrecy. "Some statements seemed contradictory," he continued, "yet when examined with attention to human behaviour, they reveal intention, concern, and the careful navigation of social codes." Villagers shifted, some leaning in, others frowning in thought. Subtle social corrections took place, whispers and glances exchanged, reflecting the delicate balance of politeness and disclosure that marked Lochdu life. Lugs padded beside Hamish, tail brushing against his legs, ears flicking, signalling alertness. Blair, exasperated, stepped forward, attempting to claim authority. "Macbeth, surely we can say it plainly. Someone is at fault here." Hamish's eyes flicked to him, expression neutral, voice calm. "Fault is less useful than understanding. Knowing why actions occurred, what pressures and misperceptions shaped them, allows us to prevent repetition and protect both people and relationships." Blair's face reddened. Daviot fidgeted with his cuffs, and Anderson scrawled notes eagerly, trying to make sense of the calm exposition. Hamish allowed them their illusions of control while guiding the room subtly. He continued, addressing red herrings carefully. The lost jacket, the minor disputes, and misremembered statements were explained within the context of human error, fog, and the day's conditions. He spoke of pride, jealousy, and hidden social tensions, how a small slight could provoke misinterpretation, and how careful observation revealed the truth beneath appearances. Villagers leaned forward subtly, eyes alert, absorbing the gentle reasoning rather than confrontation, each micro-expression catalogued by Hamish. A small moment of cosy danger reminded everyone of human vulnerability. Lugs barked sharply at a wet patch near the stone floor, causing a hotel maid to slip slightly, arms flailing before she regained balance. Hamish stepped immediately, steadying her with a calm hand. "Careful," he murmured. "Even familiar paths hold surprises when wet and uneven." The gesture was brief but effective, underscoring his quiet attentiveness and the gentle protective presence he offered the village. Murmurs of relief passed through the room, unnoticed by the officers, who were otherwise preoccupied with their own inefficiency. Hamish observed the villagers' reactions closely. A crofter's pride softened into cautious compliance. A hotel clerk straightened, acknowledging subtle correction. The Curry sisters exchanged a glance that seemed to reconcile earlier suspicion with the present explanation. Each small gesture and pause revealed layers of motivation, concern, and the human desire to maintain social equilibrium. Lugs remained alert, occasionally sniffing the air, reminding Hamish of the persistent watchfulness needed when human behaviour and environmental uncertainty intersected. The lock outside mirrored the change in mood. Drizzle eased, clouds beginning to break, light reflecting faintly on rippling water. Fog rolled back slowly, revealing glimpses of the moor and distant cottages. Hamish allowed the natural rhythms to underscore his words, letting observation and reasoning flow quietly alongside the Highland weather. The village seemed to breathe in relief, small daily actions resuming. Fishers prepared boats, crofters tended animals, hotel staff resumed tasks, each gesture restoring familiar order. Hamish concluded his quiet exposition, emphasizing subtlety rather than judgment. "We see now that human error, misperception, and the complexities of pride and secrecy have shaped events," he said softly. "No ill intent, but a web of social dynamics that required careful observation to untangle. Understanding preserves both truth and the dignity of those involved." Lugs nudged his hand, tail flicking, eyes bright with agreement. Villagers exhaled quietly, some nodding, others murmuring subdued acknowledgements, gossip muted yet aware. Blair and Davitt, despite their persistent concern with appearances, were quietly outmanoeuvred. Blair's huffing and stamping had accomplished little. Davitt's adjustments of tie and coat were unnecessary. Anderson scribbled with enthusiasm, capturing observations that would be less relevant than he believed. Hamish allowed the officers to retain the illusion of involvement, guiding the social and psychological currents with subtlety and discretion. By late afternoon, clarity had settled across the Kirk Hall and surrounding village. Red herrings were clarified, motives explained, and human behaviour laid bare without harm or shame, beyond that already inherent in pride and caution. The drizzle had eased, sunlight broke through mist in faint muted beams, reflecting on the calm loch. Hamish observed quietly, noting patterns of loyalty, subtle triumphs, and the resilience of human nature within the measured rhythms of Highland life. Lugs padded close, tail flicking, ears alert, companion to both observation and reflection. Hamish stepped outside, boots damp on stone, inhaling the cold, mist-laden air. Villagers resumed tasks with subdued calm. Crofters tended livestock, fishers prepared boats, hotel staff moved efficiently between rooms. Microdrama continued beneath the surface, but the immediate tension had eased, and the village accepted the gentle, reasoned revelation of truth. Hamish allowed himself a faint, dry smile, noting the blend of human absurdity, pride, and loyalty that had led to this point. The loch reflected calm skies, and the mist lifted slowly, curling from streets and cottages, a mirror to the clarity restored in the village's understanding. Hamish looked at Lugs, at the cottages, at the distant hills, and felt the familiar quiet satisfaction that comes from observation, patience, and empathy. Human motives had been untangled, social tensions navigated, and subtle truths revealed without melodrama or confrontation. The village would carry on, gossip and curiosity continuing, yet the core of understanding had been restored. Hamish took a slow breath, feeling the Highland air in his lungs, and began the walk home. Lugs at his side, boots leaving soft impressions on wet stone, mind cataloguing lessons, human behaviour, and the gentle triumphs of subtle justice. The rain had eased to a fine mist, curling over rooftops and the loch in soft, silvery threads. Hamish Macbeth returned slowly to his small cottage, boots damp and coat sodden, Lugs padding close behind, tail flicking, ears alert to the faintest movement along the narrow lane. The village of Lochdu had settled into its customary rhythm. Footsteps echoed softly across wet cobbles, shutters creaked in the breeze, and distant chimney smoke mingled with the damp, earthy scent of the moor. Even amid the quiet, subtle tensions lingered, half-glances exchanged in doorways, whispered assessments of events past, the careful maintenance of pride and social balance. Hamish observed it all with his usual patience, noting how the village moved gently back toward routine, leaving only the small traces of anxiety that had recently held sway. Inside the cottage, the peat fire smouldered, sending thin tendrils of smoke curling toward the low ceiling. Lugs immediately curled at Hamish's feet, nostrils twitching, tail sweeping the rug occasionally, emitting a soft, contented snore. The warmth of the fire seeped into the stone walls, softening the chill that lingered from the mist outside. Hamish hung his coat and hat on pegs by the door, damp boots squelching slightly, and allowed himself a quiet moment to observe the domestic details. A kettle warming on the stove, the faint scent of tea leaves awaiting brewing, the small pile of clothes drying near the hearth, each stitch and fold carrying its own story of routine and care. Priscilla Halberton Smythe passed the window just then, walking with measured steps along the lane, umbrella tilted against the lingering drizzle. She paused briefly, offering a polite nod and a slight smile. Hamish returned the gesture, expression neutral, eyes careful. "Good afternoon, Miss Halberton Smythe," he said softly. She inclined her head, voice calm, reserved. "Afternoon, Hamish. I trust everything has settled." The brief exchange carried the weight of social distance and subtle understanding. Priscilla represented a world Hamish admired but never fully entered, orderly, poised, restrained, and yet touched with the faintest hint of curiosity for his quiet competence. He noted the way her eyes lingered on the peat smoke curling from the chimney, the soft folds of her coat moving with the mist, and allowed a private smile at the elegance restrained by circumstance. Hamish settled near the fire, lugs shifting slightly as he nestled more comfortably, nose tucked against his paws. The day's observations passed silently through Hamish's mind, the careful movements of crofters, the cautious glances of hotel staff, the measured whispers and polite tensions of villagers negotiating pride and secrecy. He reflected quietly on human foibles uncovered, gossip, jealousy, old grudges resurfacing subtly, and the ways individuals sought to protect themselves without ever being overtly unkind. Even Blair and Davitt, with their persistent fussiness, had contributed indirectly, their missteps highlighting patterns Hamish had already discerned. Lugs gave a soft grunt, tail flicking, nudging Hamish's hand, as if to remind him that attention was always shared, companionship measured in small gestures rather than words. Tea prepared itself in the quiet kitchen, steam curling from the kettle into the chilly air, mingling with the faint peat smoke from the hearth. Hamish poured carefully, noting the dark liquid's sheen and the comfort inherent in routine. He carried the cups to the small table by the window, the misted glass softening the view of the loch and distant hills. Rain dripped faintly from eaves, pattering against stone, and the low murmur of the village beyond remained a gentle undertone. Lugs shifted, snorting softly, curling more closely to Hamish's boots, tail brushing against the floor. The domestic details, the warmth of tea, the smell of wet wool drying, the flicker of firelight, formed a quiet counterpoint to the larger mysteries that had passed through the village, a rhythm of observation and reflection that Hamish relished. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth ease damp muscles and the chill from the moor fade from his mind. The small domestic details provided a lens for understanding the day's events, a crofter's proud posture, a hotel maid's careful hesitation, the subtle avoidance of eye contact among villagers, and the micro-shifts in expression when gossip or concern surfaced. Each detail, observed quietly, carried its own significance, an insight into human behaviour that no report or written statement could capture. Lug sighed softly, tail flicking in contentment, and Hamish allowed a faint, dry smile, noting the dog's subtle readings of emotion and atmosphere. Outside, the loch mirrored the sky, silvered with mist, its surface calm after the rain. Hamish watched for a moment, noting the faint ripple of water against moored boats, the distant hills softened by fog, and the interplay of light and shadow across the wet landscape. Village life continued its gentle rhythms, Fishers tending nets, crofters checking livestock, hotel staff arranging rooms, each movement deliberate, cautious, and familiar. Even in the absence of urgency, subtle tensions remained, tempered by relief and the steady restoration of normalcy. Hamish observed the interplay of human activity and environmental cues, appreciating the continuity of routine against the backdrop of change and revelation. A faint gust of wind stirred the peat smoke, curling it through the small window, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood ash into the room. Hamish's mind drifted to the patterns of pride and secrecy he had traced, the delicate navigation of reputation, the small corrections made in whispers and glances, and the quiet adjustments of villagers attempting to maintain equilibrium. Each gesture was meaningful, each hesitation significant, and he catalogued them silently, noting how the village had absorbed revelation without unnecessary disruption. Lugs twitched in his sleep, alert to the minor noises of the room, and Hamish allowed a private, dry chuckle at the dog's impeccable timing and judgment. Hamish returned his attention to the loch, noticing how the mist shifted, softening shapes, blurring distinctions, yet revealing the faint outlines of boats, reeds, and distant paths. The highland environment mirrored the emotional closure within the village. Uncertainty eased, patterns clarified, and human tendencies observed without judgment. He allowed himself a quiet reflection on the endurance of life, the constancy of small routines, and the gentle triumph of understanding and empathy over haste and superficial judgment. The peat fire crackled gently, warmth radiating across the damp stone floor, Lugg stirring slightly, pressing his nose against Hamish's boot. Hamish took another sip of tea, letting the liquid warm him, and the familiar domestic rituals comfort him. The drying of wet gloves, the folding of damp shawls, the quiet placement of kettle and cups, all small, reassuring gestures that affirmed continuity and stability. He watched the mist curl across the loch, reflecting pale light, and thought of the village's resilience, its careful protection of social balance, and the enduring rhythms of Highland life. Priscilla passed the window once more, her presence quiet, measured, a brief nod acknowledging Hamish's attention. There was no intrusion, no expectation, only the subtle social choreography that had characterized their interactions. Hamish inclined his head slightly, lips twitching in quiet amusement, noting the elegance restrained by habit and propriety, the world he observed but could never fully inhabit. Luggs shifted his position, tail sweeping gently against the rug, and Hamish felt the familiar weight of companionship, subtle, constant, and deeply comforting. Even as the evening deepened, the mist thickened along the loch's edge, curling around stone walls and fence posts, softening shapes and silencing distant sound. Hamish reflected on the human foibles, the gossip, the pride, the jealousy, and the quiet ways people protect themselves. Each revelation had unfolded gently, guided by observation, patience, and subtle reasoning, leaving the village intact yet wiser. The minor tensions dissipated, the subtle triumphs quietly acknowledged. Luggs snorted softly, settling fully against Hamish's boot, tail flicking once more in affirmation. Hamish gazed through the misted window, the loch calm, the hills softened by fog, rooftops gleaming with residual damp. He considered the enduring presence of human imperfection, the constancy of village rhythms, and the value of subtle understanding over force or bluster. The fire crackled, sending warm light across his boots, the kettle steamed faintly, and the small domestic comforts of routine grounded him in the quiet satisfaction of observation and reflection. He allowed himself a faint, dry smile, noting the blend of melancholy and contentment, the gentle humour in human absurdity, and the steady companionship of Luggs. The rain softened entirely, leaving only the mist and the glimmer of the loch. Villagers' footsteps could be heard faintly in distance, moving between homes, tending to routines, lives returning to familiar rhythms. Hamish sipped the last of his tea, Luggs's warmth at his feet, and allowed a final moment of quiet reflection. The mysteries resolved gently, reputations protected, subtle truths acknowledged, and the enduring constancy of Highland life affirmed. The cottage smelled of peat and damp cloth, firelight flickered, and Hamish felt the familiar, quiet satisfaction of a day's work concluded with empathy, observation, and understated cleverness.